Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Women's Spirituality Capstone Colloquium presentation. This presentation is an opportunity to showcase our emerging scholars. They will be sharing their culminating research from their years in this master's degree program. These brilliant scholars are bringing healing and transformative wisdom to the world. Each has their own specialized area and unique contributions. The Women's Spirituality Department and the California Institute of Integral Studies are extremely proud of these students and soon to be master's graduates. We have a tight schedule today, which means that I will be monitoring time closely. Everyone has a set amount of time for their presentation. Sometimes there will be extra time for Q&A, sometimes there will not. If you have questions or you would like to make comments that you're not able to share live, please feel free to place them in the chat. Everyone will be here for the full session and will be able to read and respond to chat comments. It would be wonderful to remain in a longer conversation together. However, time does not permit that. So I respectfully ask that everyone remain on mute throughout the presentations. Unplanned noises can arise and may disrupt the flow or create distraction. When it is time for Q&A, you will be invited to unmute yourself to speak. You may also raise your hand using the Zoom feature if you are familiar with it. If you're not, that's fine, just unmute. And if anyone becomes unmuted during a presentation accidentally, I will immediately mute you to help maintain a focused and distraction-free environment that supports our scholars. So, thank you for being here to celebrate these extraordinary individuals and all that they have achieved. And with that, I would like to introduce you to our first scholar, Tori Hoffman. Tori is a creative marketing professional who is passionate about creating spaces that help people connect to themselves and the world around them. She's most interested in paths of connection through somatic practices, cultivating intuition, and open-hearted leadership. Tori, we are looking forward to all you have to share with us. Go ahead.
Thank you, Vivien. So I'm first going to share my screen. And thank you, Vivien. So again, my name is Tori, and today I will be talking about sensuality as an embodied approach to healing. And I just ask before I get started that if you have any questions throughout my presentation, if you just make a note of them and hold them to the end, I would really appreciate it. And if you could even refrain from typing them in the chat, I would also appreciate that too. And I look forward to getting to them at the end. So let's first begin with just a moment to arrive. I invite you to join me for a brief guided grounding practice. And so to begin, just take your gaze and look around the room and notice what you see. Differences in colors, maybe textures. Notice maybe what's on your desk, or how the light looks as it hits the walls in front of you, or shadows. And eventually you can bring your gaze to just hold a soft gaze somewhere in front of you. And if it feels nice, I invite you to close your eyes. And we're going to take a few breaths together. And how this will look is these are going to be humming breaths. I'll guide us through an inhale. And then on the exhale, you'll seal your lips and make a sound. And again, we're all on mute, so you will hear my humming as well as your own. So on your next exhale, dispense all the air out of your lungs and breathe in for 3, 2, 1. Two more. Breathe in. Last one. Inhale. and hold the silence and notice the effects of your practice. And on your next inhale, you can breathe your eyes open. Thank you. Hello again. My name is Tori, and I'm obsessed with daily practices for connection. And this can, similar to the practice we just did, and this can look like connection to the body, to the self, spirit, others, or the environment. And what I'm really interested in is how this connection can be healing and serve as a tool for social justice. And I became interested in this, and particularly with connecting with the body, because I realized that when I fail to notice my triggers or how connected I am to the world around me, I do not perform my best. Dr. Ray Johnson writes that at a fundamental level, oppression functions through disconnection, disengaging and separating us from others and from ourselves. Similarly, Starhawk writes that consciousness estrangement in its essence is when we do not see ourselves as part of the world. We are strangers to nature, to other human beings, and to parts of ourselves. So I created a workshop that helps to build connection. And this is an in-person workshop that I'm offering in Washington, D.C., which is where I live. And I'm connected to a few yoga studios and healing centers, and we're working on dates, but I'm excited to be offering it. And it's called Softening into Self, which it's an invitation to reconnect to your body and re-engage your senses. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to do a little overview of the class, but really I'm going to go into the research behind it and why I even created it. So from the moment a participant walks in, I wanted to engage their senses. So they will smell incense burning, they'll hear soft music, they'll be guided to sit down in an area that has pillows and blankets for them to touch. And then we'll go into some gentle movement for the purpose of feeling and noticing how does their body feel as they stretch a certain way or move a certain way. And from there, we'll go into a heart-centered meditation to help them connect to themselves in a different way and also to their emotions. And finally, we end with some partner work and group storytelling, where I'll offer some questions to the group, questions that even I invite you to contemplate as well. What prevents you from feeling connected to your senses? And if you were to make a small commitment to pleasure, what would you say yes to? And I designed the workshop. There's a certain flow to it that is important to note. And it starts with the body and then expands outwards for connection. Because I found through my research and through myself on my own experience is that my capacity and availability to engage with the world outside me is a mere representation of how engaged and present I am with my own body. And so in my research, I found that connecting with the body creates the conditions necessary for healing and social justice, which is some of the research I'd like to go into. My first inspiration for this class was Dr. Ray Johnson, who wrote Embodied Activism. And in their book, they wrote about this concept of somatic bandwidth, which I describe as one's capacity to feel pleasure and pain without reacting. And in the book, they talk about how somatic bandwidth is a muscle that one can build and practice building over time. And that by increasing one's somatic bandwidth, they increase their capacity to respond rather than react. They create a pause in a sense. And to me, this pause then creates the opportunity to respond strategically with kindness, with grace, and to consciously choose to respond in a more positive way that is more loving and kind. Dr. Johnson also writes about this concept of interoception, which is the ability to sense sensations from within the body. They write that cultivating our interoceptive awareness can be thought of as a particular type of inner listening that's both sensitive enough to capture the subtle whispers and consistent enough so that the body learns it doesn't need to shout to get our attention. And I like this quote because it's a reminder that while consistency is important, it's also important to have grace with oneself as they're building a practice of feeling and tolerating pain and levels of discomfort. Dr. Johnson is also an advocate for re-engaging our senses. They write that embodied activism is the emphasis and insistence on pleasure and healing, and that reclaiming our sensual selves is our birthright that has been stolen from us through commodification and objectification of our bodies. I like this because it reminds me that pleasure and committing to feeling pleasure is an act of activism, and it's an act of coming home to your body, self-respect, and committing to enjoy the life that you have been given. And this brings me to my second inspiration, which was Audre Lorde, and specifically her essay of uses of the erotic, which was published in Weaving the Visions. And Audre Lorde writes that the erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. It is an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. For having experienced the fullness of this depth of feeling and recognizing its power and honor and self-respect, we can require no less of ourselves. And throughout her whole essay, and what I feel to me, what she's trying to communicate here is that by feeling and choosing to feel pleasure and be present in the moment and the sensations that one can feel, there's a sense of aliveness that's being chosen. There's a sense of choosing to live life in a full manner and to fully get the most out of life in each moment. She writes that the erotic is not a question of what we do, it is a question of how acutely and fully we can feel in the doing. For once we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our lives, we begin to demand from ourselves and from our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with the joy we know ourselves to be capable of. And so to me, this is also a commitment to feeling joy, and pleasure goes hand in hand with that. The other piece to this is I think that when it comes to feeling and being present in each moment, when one is available to feel pleasure, they're also available to feel pain. And so one cannot be numbed without the other, which, if you're familiar with Brené Brown's work, she loves to quote that. And I really believe it's true, because if I'm committed to being fully alive in each moment, then I'm committed to feeling heartbreak just as much as I'm committed to feeling sweetness. And so I summarize this as one's capacity for joy is a reflection of their engagement with the erotic and with their ability to truly feel. And so I want to leave you with a few questions. And one of them is in quotes because Audre Lorde wrote it, and I love the way she wrote it. Um, she writes, "Can I feel how my body stretches to music and opens into response, hearkening to its deepest rhythms?" And then I'm asking, can I notice the warm sun on my skin or the feeling of hair against my neck? How fully alive am I? How fully present am I to feeling each moment? And what would my life be like if I committed to feeling just 10% more? And these are some of my references. The,
If you would like to
Here we go.
bring yourself back on, great. We have time for a couple of questions. If anyone has a question for Tori.
Hi, yes, Anna?
That was wonderful, Tori. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about how, or if this will inform you. You mentioned that you work in creative marketing, and I'm wondering if there's any ways that this work that you've done through the masters informs your work in the professional spaces. In addition.
I'm so glad you asked that because and I almost included this in the presentation. I wanted to find practices that I could bring into my daily life and that actually any professional could bring into their daily life where they could embody social justice and embody like just doing good in the world, even if their work doesn't directly translate to social justice work. It can be how they move through the world. So for me, I think about what are ways then I can inspire my team more instead of feeling maybe defensive when someone asks me a hard question at work. How can I soften? And how can I also be aware of and get curious? And then how can I also be aware of people's body language? And noticing if I'm making someone feel uncomfortable. Being aware of my own body, I think, helps me be aware of other bodies. And then what ways can I position myself? Could I smile more? Could I show them my hands? What could I do to help ease them? So thank you for asking. Any other questions?
We have time for two more.
Jessica?
Wait, I don't think you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can? Oh, okay, it worked. Uh, Going on that marketing, following on that marketing that Anna just talked about, when you do your marketing work, are you seeing that things are shifting to more of an emotional state? When you were doing marketing for, I don't know what company you work for, are they looking to touch people's emotions?
I think always they're always trying to hit a narrative, and I think always they're um you know, pain does sell, I think. So sometimes people will pitch to pains, even if that's not directly translated. That can be an underlying thing that they're trying to rub up against. But also, so does pitching to visions and what someone really wants. So you can go about it in two different ways. And I see it both ways for sure. Logan?
Well, first, thank you, Tori, so much for sharing with us. I feel called to ask about whether this has been present in your work before or whether this is something you could speak to anticipating in your workshops. Is there, whether it's sensory or emotional, something that feels especially difficult for people you're working with to access? Something that feels very disconnected, something that feels very far from the realm of their sensuality as a daily practice.
And can you restate the question? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and in another way, what do you think is most difficult for us to access? Is it our sensory input? Is it certain emotions? What is the thing that you see as if we could connect to this one aspect of our experiencing, we would be able to embody sensuality in our daily practice? Like, what do people give you feedback about as something that's especially difficult about that?
I think it really does depend on the person and what they've been through. And for example, something that may be extraordinarily triggering to me would not be where my body may have a response to numb, may not be triggering to someone else. And I actually think, though, that probably what the biggest challenges and stressor that I could say is most common is just the way our world is designed, where we're on screens and we're rewarded for thinking and doing and activating. And honestly, we're rewarded for even overthinking, which I mean, there is benefits, of course, we have to be strategic in our life, but I think that it's helpful to have curated spaces and time to connect with the senses in whatever way is accessible. And that's my hope for this container. And I love that I'm in DC because I'm around a lot of very busy people. And my hope is that they could come here, arrive, and at the very least, it's some container where maybe they could connect their body just 10% more. Thank you.
Tori, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation and your lovely work. I know it's going to help so many, and I'm looking forward to hearing what happens. So I hope you
Thank
keep in
you.
touch and send information and send when you open, when you start, send links so that we can share with everyone. And for everyone, I'm going to put in the chat the site to connect with Tori on LinkedIn. If anyone has questions arise after this or comments or thoughts, please put them in the chat. Tori will be here. Tori will be seeing everything and will be able to respond to you there. So thank you very much, Tori. I appreciate it. And now I am excited to introduce our next scholar. Natalie Hessell. So Natalie resides in the Midwest and is a full-time student, career writing scholarship fellow, mother, and lactation consultant. Her interests lie in the intersection of language, divine feminine spirituality, and equity. Upon graduation with an MA in Women's Studies, Gender Studies, and Social Justice, Natalie will continue at CIIS, or California Institute of Integral Studies, in the Women's Spirituality Ph.D. program. Yay! Welcome, Natalie. What do you have to share with us?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Vivien. So, welcome to my presentation today on gender, language, and our concept of the divine. My name again is Natalie Hessell. Today, we will be exploring together how the gender of God influences our lives, whether we realize it or not. I invite you to listen, take notes, and think of questions. I will be asking some questions of you throughout this presentation. However, I'd like you to hold on to those questions. You may present them in the chat. However, I will not check the chat till after the presentation. So, who am I and why is this important to me? Today, we're going to be talking about a subject that is often off limits, God. This is a picture of me back in the 1970s in my church's Christmas program. Today, I am a mother, a student, and a lactation consultant in Midwest America. My life is centered around the mother. However, in the world in which I live, God exists and God is male. I grew up in a Protestant church in a tiny town. As I grew up, like many young people, I began to question how my religion worked. There were things I could not accept, like you had to be saved to get into heaven. And there were things I was lucky enough to be introduced to, that there are multiple authors to the Bible, each with their own agenda, that women are equal, and maybe God wasn't a man. That little girl in the church, like many little girls, may have grown up never questioning the gender of God, but eventually I did. And while I acknowledge the divine today, I ask myself, how important is it for that divine to be female? You may ask yourself how relevant this is in your own life. Maybe you are an atheist, or maybe your spirituality doesn't view the divine with such gender duality. But even so, I will argue that how a society conceptualizes the divine does matter, and it influences what we believe about ourselves and how we interact with our world. Humans have had a concept of the divine for a long time, maybe over 200,000 years or longer, and we have had language for over 100,000 years. But what names have we held for the divine over the millennia? What symbols have we created to embody the divine? The images I am sharing have been created to embody. The images that I'm sharing are female symbols, and they are a tiny fraction of the female icons that exist. They are ancient. One of my favorites is the Holy Fels figure in the upper left. She was found in a cave in Central Europe, and she is over 30,000 years old. I also include female figures from South America, Asia, and Africa. Are they divine? Maybe, but maybe not. They reflect the importance of women in their cultures, their abundance hinting at normalcy, a commonality of the female and her importance. My goal here is not to argue or present information on matriarchal cultures. My goal is to challenge myself and my audience to contemplate how we humans think about the divine, gender, and how the symbolism we use affects our brain and our behavior. God as a white man. This image catches the eye, the light, the outstretched hands. Maybe it reminds you of other AI images in the news lately. To create this image, I used a free service, OpenAI, and I typed one word, God, with a lowercase g. This was the first image that was generated. Now, AI tends to reflect the dominant culture, and most people in the US believe in a God, and they imagine that God to be white and male, like this image. This is true, even if a person does not claim a religion. We operate under the function of a male God. Our iconography is overwhelmingly male. Our prayers are directed to a male Lord, and the God in our artwork is often male. Our nation is patriarchal, and this male God validates the authority of those patriarchal institutions. The male God symbolism is associated with many things, including a conservative gender ideology, authoritarianism, militarism, oppression, sexism, both benevolent and hostile, hierarchy, and restrictive social policies. As this AI image reflects, women are not represented in the divine, at least not easily, and they cannot easily see themselves reflected in the divine. But men are given authority to rule from God in whose image they share. And so for women, to question men can be to question God. So how does the language we use and the iconography we experience contribute to these oppressive factors? Women are operating under a male God are more likely to have poor economic situations, suffer abuse, and be limited in their self-determination. A symbol's effect does not depend on rational assent, for a symbol also functions on levels of the psyche other than the rational. That's a quote by Carol P. Christ, who is a prominent feminist theologian. And what she's saying there is the symbols in our society, they affect our brain, they affect the way we think, whether we realize it or not. And that's important to keep in mind because those symbols, they get developed at a very early age. Most children have developed a concept of the divine by their early preschool years. So how does a young girl see herself when she cannot see herself in the divine? How is a young boy limited by not having a divine feminine influence? Let's think of the words that we use when we describe God. Think of the opening lines in prayers in religious institutions, when we attend funerals or weddings or before a meal. Let's look at this image of the Lord's Prayer. It's a very familiar prayer, and we see the familiar white Jesus in the background, which is a common cultural iconography. I am not arguing against the message of this prayer. It is a prayer that has brought comfort to many. But what I am asking us to question is the male focus of this prayer in both word and image. And here are some common cultural words from the divine. Here we see a girl surrounded by really very common words for the divine in our culture. He, Abba, King of Kings, Master, Lord, God, or Heavenly Father. These words are very commonplace. Think about how you feel when you read these titles. Do they exist in your world? What if we challenge them? What happens for the girl in this image, for this world, if we change our language and bring in divine feminine terminology? I did not mean canceling out the divine male, but finding a balance, finding representation. Egalitarian deities could benefit us all. So how do we incorporate the divine feminine in language and in practice? Bringing in the divine feminine can be a challenge, and it will not look the same for everyone. I chose to share these images of Asherah, a Semitic goddess, because she was one of the first goddesses that I read about, and I was fascinated with her existence. You may be familiar with Asherah as the partner of Yahweh. You may have heard of her groves of trees. The handprint above is Asherah's handprint, and it symbolizes her protection. Asherah was named in the Bible of my upbringing, but she was invisible to us. She was invisible to me. But what if the divine feminine were not invisible? What if we used her names? Naming is important. If the name we carry can influence the path of our life, does it follow that our names for the divine could influence our lives as well? Our current administration understands the power in naming. Think about the recent change of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. Even if not a legal change, it gets attention. So the words we use matter. How would the United States approach to war and domination look if Secretary of War Pete Hegseth prayed to Mother Earth or Spider-Woman for guidance and wisdom? Would we be so eager to kill each other in our earth if we saw the divine feminine within ourselves, if we saw the divine feminine within our earth? So how do we accomplish this? Do we rebrand God as gender neutral, or do we create new names or reclaim names for the divine feminine? How do we most successfully incorporate this? So we have colonial, oppressive, patriarchal systems in place, and these systems serve the status quo. Do we reform the systems we have, or do we create new systems? We could add in feminine terms for the American God. We could say that God is gender neutral, adding in a she or a they. But what will change? You may wonder why I have a blue t-shirt on this slide. In the last several years, gender-neutral clothing for children has become popular. However, what I have noticed is that most of the clothing looks a lot like boys' clothing without a truck or a dinosaur. It didn't look like clothing in the girls' section. It looked to me like girls were the ones being asked to change. However, I do see benefits of gender-neutral God and clothing. But are we keeping our patriarchal God and our patriarchal system and calling it good without doing the work? Or will a change in language change the system and change the beliefs? I believe it can be both. Patriarchal systems will not be eliminated by a simple name change, but renaming can influence our behaviors. What if we radically accepted and named the divine feminine in her own existence? Not just adding a she or a they onto a white male concept. How would women thrive by participating in a new spirituality that centers the divine feminine while not excluding the divine male, but making it okay to center the female? Would our world be more peaceful and more egalitarian? It's a complicated question, and like many complicated questions, there is not necessarily one answer. However, there are some promising examples to explore. But before we look at them, let's look at an example from pop culture, a current series called George and Mandy's First Marriage, which is a spinoff of Young Sheldon. In this particular episode, it questions the gender of God and reflects the power of conformity. During this episode, Mandy, pictured here, is a TV reporter, and she's on live with their community pastor, who looks up and thanks him for the weather. Mandy adds in, or her. What results is Mandy losing her job, Georgie, her husband, losing customers at his store, and their families pressuring her to apologize. While this is fiction, it does tell us how straying from the status quo can make life really uncomfortable. Now let's look at some models that work. A feminine concept of the divine is associated with higher self-worth, more generous social support, and people who tend to care about each other and the earth. It allows for women to thrive with a positive sense of self. It allows for women to see the divine within themselves. A gerontologist named Lydia K. Manning conducted a study of aging contemporary women. These women incorporated the divine feminine into their lives and into their rituals. And the results were compelling. These women saw the divine in themselves. They reported high levels of self-confidence and self-determination and freedom. They had the benefit of existing outside of patriarchal confines. They were able to create their own reality and they thrived. Now, this particular study was small. It was mainly limited to white, middle class, and older women. Perhaps this model worked because these women had the social and economic freedom to break ties with patriarchal institutions. Claiming a divine feminine didn't break up a marriage. It didn't cause them to lose their parents or threaten their jobs. But that is my point. Claiming the divine feminine should be safe for everyone. However, we do not all have the freedom to create our own spirituality or join an egalitarian spiritual community. So what can we do? If this work calls to you, we can challenge our thinking. We can normalize using feminine terms for the divine. We can research and we can ask questions where appropriate. We can study the voices that advocate for the divine feminine. And we can ask if the institutions we have in place can support a truly equal society and what role a divine feminine could play. I do not have all the answers, but I hope that I have the beginning of answers for myself and that I can inspire further inquiry in both myself and our communities. In closing, let's take in the multitude of names for the divine feminine. Isis, Pachamama, divine feminine, Spider Woman, Yuki Onna, Ashura, Guan Yin, Kelly Burr, Wisdom, Yamoya, Inanna, Mother Earth, Great Mother, Perchta, or simply she. Oh, I think I see Anna raising her hand. Yes, Anna.
Hi, I don't want to, if anyone else wants to go, I know I asked the first question last time, but I have a question for you, Natalie, that is a hard question, but
Okay.
hopefully you'll be up for it. And it is one that there's no right answer.
I'll do my best.
It's truly, there's no right answer.
Yeah.
This is not a setup. But I was noticing throughout the presentation, you're using the term the divine feminine and in sort of, and speaking sort of in a singular and then invoking different.
Yes.
And I would love, maybe I'll just leave it at that. Like that's a sort of a choice rather than, sort of to do the singular.
Yes.
And I would love to hear your thoughts on like what that on that choice.
No,
and maybe
that is a good choice and a good question.
Okay.
And I'm actually in evolution right there. I just took Christianity and Paganism, which was an excellent course. I loved it. And I had really never thought about how monotheism influences our interpretation of like our modern goddess movement. So my thought process is evolving there. So when I say the divine feminine, I'm not necessarily meaning a singular because I don't think it's singular. But on the other hand, I think a lot about how do we make something like this work in our world? Like, I think a lot about how are we fitting this into something that's accepted? Do we have to fit it into our patriarchal model for the world to accept it? Would it be too out there if we followed a more polytheistic model, which is really probably how people used to live? And I think it's very valid. And it's a good question. I would say yes, I'm in the process of learning more about that. But yeah, I agree. It's not singular. And when I say it, I don't necessarily mean it's singular, but I think it can be anything you want it to be.
Thank you, Natalie. And that was not it was not coming as a critique of
Oh, I know.
monotheism. Many people use the divine and there's philosophy and theology around sort of immanence and all of it.
Yeah.
So it was a curiosity. So thank you. Thank you.
You'll have to read my paper, Anna, because I go into this in my paper.
We have time for another question.
Oh, Jessica.
I absolutely love this topic. You did such an incredible job. My question is, where did you use or find most of your sources? What did you pull from the most?
So I didn't show you my source page, but I have a source page. I mean, I definitely drew from, well-known, feminist theologians, Carol Christ, and, I mentioned her in there. I took some from linguists as well, learning about how language affects us and how it affects our choices. There was a really interesting study that I looked at in Sweden on pronouns. I just didn't have enough time to put it into my my presentation today, but it was about creating a whole new pronoun and how that changed people's people's attitudes and the amount of time that it took. It did not take very long for that to happen. And there were several scholars, sociologists, psychologists who have done work, looking to see how people really conceptualize the divine in the United States, and that's just the one thing that really struck me, was that most people, whether they acknowledge a God or not, they have this image in their mind of God being a white man, and that can be the guiding force or kind of a guiding voice, like that little Jiminy Cricket, if you think of Pinocchio, that's telling us, kind of guiding our lives. And even if we don't realize it or not. So my goal is to challenge that. And I'm challenging myself to not divert or revert to that, to he. Even when I even try to do that now when I look at animals, and I might think, oh, but that little squirrel, isn't he cute? But no, let's change that and not necessarily think the default he, which is what we do with God as well. And I just think it's fascinating how it could change the way we think about ourselves.
Thank you.
Tori, I know you're a lactation consultant, and I'm wondering how this will impact your work going forward.
Yes. So I think I'm very lucky in that the work that I do sets me up for this very, very easily, because I work with mostly women. I see mostly women. I'm sitting with them in some of the most vulnerable times in their life. I keep tissues nearby because there's crying in my room every day. So I think I just see the divine in women. Just I could see it anyway, but now I see it so much more. Divinity isn't about power. It's about love and sharing and just being together. And I think I see it in our most vulnerable moments. And what if we just acknowledge that? What if we weren't afraid? We weren't afraid to be vulnerable and know that it's okay to cry with someone. It's okay for life to be hard. It's okay to, it's okay to leak milk all over the place and 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 cry. It's okay. Yeah. That's where the beauty in life, that's what life is all about. And so yeah, I think it's a great question. It just helps me see the divine in everything. Because I get the privilege of seeing life at the very beginning, and I've had the opportunity to see life at the very end, more in these recent years too. I see that overlap, and the divine's in all of us, whether we know it or not.
Thank you. Beautiful presentation. Ooh, loved it. And looking forward to reading the full paper. So thank you, Natalie. I would love to introduce you to Logan. Logan intends to foster resilient relations with their community by embracing the wisdom that comes from the lived experience of those around them. Logan commits to this as a daily practice through their consumption, actions, words, and beliefs as primary sites of responsibility. They embody a perspective of the present as an ethic, a practice, and an extension of their integral commitment to leaving the planet better than they found it. And it is with much joy I introduce you to Logan.
Thank you, Vivien. I'm tremendously humbled to be in the space of our presenters before us, and specifically Natalie. That was quite a beautiful segue into the subject that I would like to bring forward for all of us today, where you were speaking to the beginning of life and that privilege. And I would like to talk a bit about the quote so-called other end of that spectrum through decolonial death studies. My name is Logan Soderling, and today I want to discuss the perspective of decolonial death studies, which is a discussion that includes the social, cultural context in which death and death traditions take place in the United States. The lens of this material is discussing death as a form of reclaiming dignity. And there is a lot of ground I want to cover, so I'm going to start by orienting through some definitions. Decolonial death studies recognizes the ongoing colonial violence in the presence of white supremacist ideology and capitalist systems that prioritize profit with very little regard for life. The political and social implications of whose deaths are grievable, whose deaths are legitimized, and whose deaths are disregarded reflects the hierarchical value system and priorities of colonialism. Informed by differences like gender, race, class, sexuality, varying abilities, which result in unequal risk of violence and death weaponized to maintain systems of power and profitability. The lives of Anglophone or white identifying people are privileged as the most valuable, which translates to greater recognition of their deaths compared to the people of the global majority who are not white. A decolonial framework does not position any one life form or group of people as central or superior to another. Rejecting this form of thinking requires the inclusion of perspectives and traditions that have been suppressed as a result of colonialism, which is a tremendous inspiration for this presentation. Since I'm the person speaking, I'd like to orient with who it is you're listening to today. And my experience with death began in 2020, marking my personal journey where all three of my grandfathers passed away within months of one another. In those transitions, I saw complex family systems, medical regulations, financial strain, and paralyzing fear of the subject, all of which ignited my belief that there had to be another way of engaging with death. My current grief work revolves around flower farming for funerals, ceremonies, and celebrations. Like the flowers that you see on the slide actually came from that farm. Flowers have become a teacher about grief, guiding me to surrender to the impermanence of just about everything. And so existing in this world today means by some variation in terms of proximity, we are all connected to grief from choiceless events that happen in life. We all have access to this subject, even if we do not know someone who has passed. This subject involves some of the most complex emotions we experience in this life. So exploring this material should be done with the safety of self-guided curiosity. If you are not in a place to discuss death and dying, please take care of yourself and continue to do so if you choose to make yourself available to this material in this presentation today. For reference, there will be no gore, no violent imagery, but this material does explore the death industry, which carries its own weight in each of us. So I invite us to gently land in our body to create the container for the continued experience of this presentation, so that we can embrace and exercise our right to listen to our bodies. If we can invite our breathing to take place in our diaphragm rather than in our chest and find presence. Listening to whether we are feeling settled or not in this moment. I would like to invite us to consider our capacity for the conversation and continue accordingly, whether or not that is your choice. And if it feels comfortable to invite forward a memory, a person, a life form, any legacy you would like to be present in the consideration of this subject. For me, I invite in the memory of my grandfather, Bill Songer, to be held in this space as we explore why our experience of death is what it is today in the United States. We will hold these legacies together. And if there's interest, feel free to celebrate the names of who you've invited into this space in the chat. I envision an embodied death practice that begins with discussion and preparation. A just death requires that we dignify the end-of-life transition in all life forms and ask ourselves how we contribute to or disrupt this thinking in our actions. My vision is guided by the questions: how can discussing death allow us to live more fully? What ceremony has been stifled and omitted from our culture? And how did we get to the way it is now? Reflecting on our experiences with death, many of us have attended funerals, known someone who has been buried in a casket, or know someone who chose instead to be cremated. The following slides are death rituals from various parts of the globe to first orient through the traditions that exist beyond the United States before we narrow the focus to North American traditions. Ritual and ceremony in death is one of humankind's oldest traditions. It may even be the oldest. I wanted to offer some rituals from around the world to weave in our personal considerations of respect and dignity in death, because across cultures, these conceptions may contradict one another. In Tibet, Buddhist faith informs the practice of sky burials, where bodies are placed on high peaks for the birds of prey. Similarly, in Iran, which is the photo on the left, informed by the very old religion of Zoroastrianism, the guiding belief is that the body may pollute the soil, which is why, similar to Tibet, towers and high peaks are the optimal site for placing the dead in their final resting place, in alignment with the element of wind. In Varanasi, India, there are Hindu funeral pyres that burn by the Ganges River 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the belief is that by cremation, by fire, is the only way to release the soul from the cycles of reincarnation. While in Madagascar, the guiding faith believes that until the bones of a person decompose, they cannot join the ancestral realm. So rather than leaving bodies in the ground where they are in a state of limbo, they exhume the bodies, rewrap them in fresh funeral shrouds, and dance with their loved ones every 5 to 7 years. My invitation in the consideration of these ceremonies is asking yourself what these practices evoke in your mind without judgment of that answer. Contrasting these traditions with the United States, which is informed by very different cultural norms, very different cultural values, and namely profitability. Many of us have seen or experienced funeral spaces similar to these photos. Whether ceremonies take place indoors or outdoors, beside the casket, there are very specific expectations for conduct. Wearing all black, respectful, somber demeanor, expressing condolences, and specific permissions to express grief in this space that isn't necessarily permitted anywhere else but in the privacy of the home. And of course, this is one form of funeral, but this is the, quote, status quo that I am referring to in the United States. Funeral homes such as these vary across the United States, and there are approximately 19,000 similar to this one. The funeral industry generates around $20 billion annually, and 20% of those funeral homes are owned by a small group of corporations that purchase these funeral homes, maintain the family-owned outer exterior, even though they become part of this corporation, this chain of funeral homes. This industry is designed to be profitable, and increasingly so with every year. The average cost to the consumer in 2024 was $7,848. The leading corporation in the United States is Service Corporation International, who developed the cluster model of purchasing funeral homes in the same geographic area as one another and applying a framework of corporate practice that basically saves resources for cost efficiency. They own upwards of 10 different business fronts. A few of them are at the bottom of the slide that cater to all the different needs and the tiers of economic capacity for people seeking funeral service in the United States. Caskets, funeral homes, and crematoriums included. A 2025 survey by the National Funeral Directors Association found that 46% of funeral directors plan to retire within the next 5 years, When no family successor is available, many directors sell to corporate buyers like SCI. This industry is intended to prioritize relationships of care within communities, but this is becoming less and less possible every year as profitability is prioritized. The next 5 years in the United States present an opportunity to shift the cultural standards of death practices in favor of people over profit, if we're willing to consider why these are the standard practices in the first place. On the next slide is a historical image. I just want to prepare people. There are 2 bodies in coffins. It's a very old image. It's not gory, but I did want to let people know what's coming. So how did we get here? Thousands of years of death ceremony and ritual has been dramatically disregarded in favor of profitability and misleading science in the United States. Death traditions have historically and globally been oriented around land and land-based wisdom. The legacy of this continent is the violent subjugation of communities of African peoples that were trafficked to this country, as well as the First Nations indigenous people of this land. It's estimated over 6 million people died while enslaved on the land of the US between the early 1600s and the Civil War, and that their remains are still largely unknown, because plantation owners did what they could to remove any semblance of ceremony from these burials. Funerals of more than a few gatherers were forbidden, burials could only take place in the dark, and no written grave markers were allowed. Even in death, no humanity was granted. And this legacy is important in recognizing how we treat death as a reflection of what value we assign to life. Colonial expansion across the continent depended on the devaluation of life in its human, animal, more than human, plant forms, meaning that death has been seen as from a utilitarian standpoint. At this point in time, families were responsible for processing and burying family members. The images on the slide include, on the right, a coffin designed from the 18th century, known as a safety coffin, which resulted from the medicine of the time and people's concerns about being buried alive. At this point, coffins were built by furniture builders, and they were made to order to the specification of a person who passed. On the left is a Civil War encampment where embalmers are advertising their services on the battlefield, charging soldiers a heavy fee to ensure their bodies made it back to their home and families, which were largely Protestant at the time, and including a Protestant ethic, which involved a viewing and a funeral service. So prior to the Civil War, there wasn't a need or demand for embalming. In fact, it really was because of the Civil War that embalming rose to popularity, as Northern soldiers were being transported by trains back to their families and were decomposing along the way. So train conductors were tossing bodies off of trains, and embalmers saw this as an opportunity to expand their business. As the Civil War ended, however, the need for embalming was projected to decrease, which coincidentally is when the belief that bodies were too diseased to be handled by anyone but professionals started to become the cultural norm, which I would like to quickly refute. Right after a person dies, disease, bacteria leaves the body, and it's actually one of the safest times to be around another person. It was unfounded science at the time, and it is still unfounded science today. So the Civil War marked the transition of death care being the responsibility of family, largely the women in the family, to strangers, professionals stating that the process was too risky for anyone but them to undertake. A legacy that persists today in the form of standard practice, a practice which involves preservative chemicals that prevent the natural decomposition process, which eventually pollutes the soil in which a person is buried. The current practices are isolating from community, where the expectation is that grief happens in private, isolating from connection to land through practices that pollute and prevent our body from rejoining the environment, and isolated from honesty with oneself about the shame and avoidance of the subject in general. So what can we do? I argue collective remembering is a good start. Remembering refers to the act of recognizing what has been forgotten and the process of putting oneself back together. Parts of ourselves we may or may not have realized were missing in the first place. Remembering is an active practice of reclamation within the body, mind, and spirit. Remembering may include the sacredness of death practices that do not require preservative chemicals and shame-ridden avoidance in favor of experiences we didn't know were stolen from us. Emerging options for exploration include community support networks and at-home funerals that may both alleviate the financial strain on families entirely. Engaging with a death doula or practitioner to help plan for and move through the end-of-life transition for a loved one, and reclaiming the land-based wisdom of environmentally friendly alternatives to practices like embalming. Included in the pictures are tree burials and wreath burials for consideration. And how do we do this? Dissolve disillusion, which may look like the cataloging work of disregarded cemeteries and burial locations, returning Indigenous human remains that are on display in museums, pushing for legislation and accountability in ongoing injustices leading to premature death, dignifying death care for ourselves with transparency and honesty by establishing wills and directives early, and inquiring into viable alternatives based on our beliefs and the restrictions of our subjective locations. Through all of this, we must decide what suits us best. Remembering also includes the legacies of the people and memories that you all might have invited into the space with the rest of us. So I would just like to take a moment to thank you, those who are present with us, and promise to honor their legacies in the further consideration of this subject and the ways that we may all commit to promoting the dignity of life as well. This is my bibliography, and I just wanted to leave on this page. These are some images of my grandfather who I invited into this space with us.
Thank you, Logan. Absolutely brilliant. Just in an aspect of social justice that I hadn't considered before that is now absolutely integral to life. And something I look forward to learning more about from you. So thank you. We do have time for a couple of questions if anyone would like to ask Logan a question.
Hi, Ariel.
Oh, that was so powerful. First of all, just thank you. This is like a deeply personal question, less like academic, so I don't know how appropriate that is. Um, but for people who have experienced grief, in a way that and maybe the rituals around it were just like deeply embedded in the I don't want to call them troubling practices, but like the practices that our culture has gotten used to that aren't necessarily serving us in the ways you've pointed out. And I feel like a lot of remorse and additional grief around how that played out. I don't know if that's anything you've experienced in like this call to be more attentive and aware and intentional about practices moving forward. Do you include in your work any strategies for like revisiting burials or rituals that maybe played out in a way that don't feel aligned or restorative or healing, if that makes sense?
It absolutely does, Ariel, and thank you. I just saw that you put in the chat the legacy of your mom, Mary Beth, and I just wanted to name her and thank her presence and legacy as well. In your question, I think first of all, I can't imagine what of the academic isn't personal, and so I wanted to say that first, and thanking you for asking the question. One of the slides that I included in the presentation under how do we do this was a picture from an article called The Cemetery as a Public Space. And in terms of returning to the traditions, ceremonies, or rituals, as you said, that may have not served us with the ethic we hold in the present, and retroactively doing a restorative practice of presence, I think that there is so much that can be offered there. so much presence of honoring the futurity moving forward, but also coming to the legacy of the person as they were and promising to do different. I don't know if there is an aspect in my response to you that also could address the linear time of like the binary between life and death. It's not something that I hold within myself. And so I see this merging or this confluence between life and death as there isn't an end to something that didn't serve you in the past and maybe didn't serve your mother's memory to your appreciation happening in the past, because it's still ongoing with how you hold it within yourself and how you hold it within your family. And I don't know if there's enough specificity to that, but I'm holding that deeply. And I thank you, Ariel, for that question. And I think my most direct answer has to do with your ethic and how you hold it as a persisting legacy of your mother.
Thank you. One more question?
Yes, I have a question. If you had more time, are there any other topics or research that you would have loved to explore in this presentation? Brilliant presentation. Thank you.
Oh, Sam, your voice, I love your voice. Thank you for that question. I think there's an element of being entrenched and living in this material as a daily practice that feels like I just covered like a fingernail's worth of material, and it feels insufficient in some ways in terms of the scope and the scale of the beautiful scholarship that's coming forward. But I truly think that in the most applicable and accessible way, going into what I briefly got to speak about with the body not being a diseased entity that we're supposed to avoid and immediately relinquish to professionals. There are limitations in terms of when the decomposition process starts, and that's about 48 hours usually is the legal limit within states, before you have to, release your loved one to the state in order to be housed or processed. But within that time, I wish I'd known in my own experience when my grandfather, Bill Songer, when he passed, with my mom and myself being present with him, I felt this urge, this very small timeline of we need to tell somebody that he's gone. We need to move and be actionable, and they need to come take him away, and they need to remove this from our sight. And I think that any of us who have access to holding that experience or will in the future deserves the dignity of an expansive amount of presence, just like the way I want all of us to hold the presence of when a baby is born, that spiritually transforming sense of embodiment and presence that can also come from death. And I think that really is just the most important contribution for me. And thank you for asking that.
Thank you so much, Logan. I really appreciate you, your scholarship, your heart. And I just want to remind everyone, if you have more questions or comments for Logan, for Natalie, for Tori, they are all still here. They are on chat. So please place anything you want into the chat for them, since we don't have time to do longer discussions. But thank you, Logan. Brilliant work. And I am so looking forward to what comes next. Thank you. Okay. I would like to introduce our next scholar, who I'm absolutely in love with. I would like you to meet Dionne Scott-Boissard. And Dionne is a licensed clinical mental health counselor with over a decade of experience as a psychotherapist. As the founder and owner of Peace of Mind Mental Wellness Services, Dionne is committed to helping individuals address and overcome the challenges of generational trauma. Her approach emphasizes the importance of authentic living and discovering both joy and fulfillment in one's life. In addition to her professional work, Dionne is a wife and mother whose personal life reflects these values. Dionne, please enlighten us.
Okay. So everybody know I'm sitting here with all these nerves, but I am here and I am ready. So I am going to just share my screen. And share my sound. All right, everyone seeing the screen?
Just a moment. Yes, we got it.
Got it. All right, so good afternoon to all here in attendance. My name is Dionne Scott-Boissard. I thank you for attending my final presentation in the Master's Program of the Women's Spirituality Department. My final presentation is entitled Remembering the Divine Mother, an Ancestral Journey from Generational Trauma to Worthiness. So please save any questions you may have until the end, and I will be happy to answer after the presentation. Thank you. So my story begins with the historical events of 2020, which significantly changed the course of my life and created opportunities that would lead to unimaginable experiences. Although I didn't watch the entire George Floyd video, hearing his single plea of mama awakened an ancestral anger within me. To process this anger, I began writing and discovered an inner guidance that reconnected me with an ancient maternal wisdom who refused to be forgotten any longer. So, amidst the global pandemic and social unrest, I left my full-time job. I launched an online private practice entitled Peace of Mind Mental Wellness Services, and I traveled to Africa. The picture you see is my logo, which represents or embodies the spiritual transformation I experienced on my journey to self-worth. It was fall of 2023 when I sat down at my dining room table in Luxor, Egypt, y'all, and applied to the Women's Spirituality Department at California Institute of Integral Studies. At the time, I was simply being obedient to my spirit and this maternal wisdom who had been guiding me thus far, totally unaware of the woman I was and am continuously becoming. So, for this presentation, I want to take you on my ancestral journey from generational trauma to worthiness through remembrance of the Divine Mother. Over the past 6 years, I've learned that the decentralization experienced within the lineage of Black women perpetuates generational harm and dismembers perceptions of worthiness. Through spiritual technologies and ancestral remembrance, the Divine Mother becomes the centralized foundation for transforming generational survival into generational worth. All right, here we go. So as a little girl, I would stare outside from my bedroom window of the Yonkers, New York apartment where I was raised, and I would wonder what truths held my story beyond the George Washington Bridge. I struggled with cultural identity and self-worth. I could see the culture through the different languages and food and music and celebrations of others. But what was the culture of Black people beyond enslavement? Who was I? As I became an adult, socially imposed titles such as African American or person of color or woman of color felt unrelatable. BIPOC lazily reduced me down to an acronym. So it became important for me to name myself for myself. Acknowledgement of my Blackness in America felt necessary. Indigenous rooted my soul to this American soil in a way that honors the endurance of my enslaved African mothers whose bodies were used to breed and birth babies sold for this land. And for all my African ancestors who were brutally displaced and dismembered from their motherland, yet found a way to survive so that I could be here today. So I don't ask anymore, who am I? As a Black, Indigenous, American woman of the African diaspora, I am rooted in whole person remembrance of my ancestors and their stories that span between 2 continents. Generational trauma. Generational trauma extends across several generations and affects how people process and recover from ongoing trauma. If we do not heal these generational wounds, we inadvertently pass on the fear, insecurity, mistrust, and unworthiness, which perpetuates modes of survival. As part of the transformation I experienced after 2020, I was spiritually guided to reread The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. The main character, 11-year-old Piccola Breedlove, embodies the unworthiness born from generational trauma. In brief, this little girl is mocked for her ugliness by peers and adults alike, which is internalized as self-hatred. She believes that if only she had blue eyes, which symbolize beauty and an escape from her biological misfortune, that she would finally be worthy of love and respect. Like the many characters in this book, I too had used Piccola as a scapegoat for my own insecurities of unworthiness. Rereading this book left me to reconcile the generational trauma of my own inner child who didn't know her worth and who didn't know she was a queen. So I adopted Piccola as my inner child, and I promised to carry the essence of her beauty as my why for centering my work on Black women's remembrance of their worth. Soon after, I began to develop a deep practice of interconnection through the spiritual technologies and rituals of prayer, meditation, affirmations, and gratitude. My ancestors began to speak to me. And initially, it was my dad who came through from the ancestral realm to guide me through the fear of this very unfamiliar connection. However, it wasn't until much later, with my work on the Motherline Project in the Sacred Lineage class, that I recognized this eternal connection I have with my maternal grandmother, Anna. She is the ancestor you see on each slide bearing witness to my story, as she has my whole life. She died tragically when my mom was only about 4 years old. The lingering trauma within my maternal lineage has left an imprint on my soul to be repeated or healed in this lifetime. You see, the maternal line is only passed down from mother to daughter. As a mother of 4 sons and no daughters, I am the daughtering out of this maternal line. When I cross over into the ancestral realm, this maternal lineage will be complete. So I'm not here to simply live this life and die. I'm here to heal the generational cycle of my mother line and pass on a legacy of new beginnings to my sons and future generations. Through prayer, meditation, and the guidance of my ancestors, I was invited by the mayor of my town to join a committee for revitalizing a historical African and Native American burial, which was initially referred to as the Colored Cemetery. This community work gave structure to that ancestral anger that started me on this journey. I became a guardian of the ancestors interred, charged with connecting their memory to this land and telling their stories. We renamed the burial the sacred place of my ancestors and commissioned renowned sculptress Vinnie Bagwell to create a healing destination. This work is ongoing and continues today as a labor of love. But this was just the beginning. The ancestors urged me to keep going and to keep seeking and to keep learning and to keep healing and to keep growing and to keep knowing and to keep expanding. And so I went to Egypt, also known by its ancient name Kemet. And from 2001 until 2024, I returned several times. It was here where the Divine Mother made her grand introduction to me. She had summoned me home to heal the generational wounds of separation that plagued my soul. The first words I heard when I stepped onto African soil was "Welcome home." I surrendered to the tears, to the anger, and to the fears. I eased into a culture that revered the divine feminine with statues and temples and revealed a deep history of my Blackness. I began to shed those old narratives of trauma. I discovered the language of my ancient mother through family, through connection, and through her story. In time, I embraced forgiveness as the tender nurturing of her divine presence. Most days were spent sitting by the water with my feet on the soil, just listening to her gentle whispers of remembrance. Divine Mother taught me 3 things. She taught me to remember who I am and to trust in her power and to know with certainty that I am loved. I returned to New York with new insight. However, my journey was incomplete. Anger still lingered, more for me to discover, and that nagging urge to keep going and keep learning, keep healing and keep growing and keep knowing and keep expanding me led me to Ghana. I developed a friendship with a young man named Albert from Ghana and began offering donations to support his alma mater, named after his grandfather, Tawuhufu Holly International School in Cape Coast, Ghana. This forward giving or this forgiving began to replace the space where anger was lingering in my heart. So I kept giving. My pilgrimage came as an invitation to be the keynote speaker at Tawuhufu Holly International School's end of the year art award and speech giving day of cultural celebration. I cannot express the level of care and welcome I received from the village of Okotichir, where the school is located. The entire community, including dignitaries and the chief of the village, all joined together for this celebration. There was dancing and drumming and performances, fashion shows, poetry, art exhibits, awards for the children, speeches, and a naming ceremony where I received my ancestral name, Nana Ama Tuwuhufu. Nana is the term of endearment bestowed on royalty. Ama means girl born on Saturday. Tuwuhufu is the name of the ancestor who has been holding the name of my return. At some point during this filling up of my soul, Albert leaned over to me and he says, "You know, all of this is in honor of you. It is our way of saying thank you and welcoming you home." Ghana gave me the gift of organic reciprocity, bridging an interconnectedness that reconnected the generationally traumatized child in me back to the forgotten culture of my American ancestors and back to our home, Mother Africa. So returning to America from Ghana grounded me in purpose. I better understood how this ancestral journey of remembrance prepared me to stand firm in my own worthiness and inspired me to share a message of healing with other Black girls. Through remembrance of our Divine Mother, we can shift generational survival into generational worth. Sankofa, which is an African word of the Akan in Ghana, that means go back and get it. Sankofa is the call to learn from the past to build a better future. In this spirit, the head high, crown straight, Black queen experience was developed as my offering of healing. As a mental wellness provider and a Black woman who has done the work to heal and hold the inner child in me, I am passionate about supporting other Black women with healing, generational trauma, reestablishing divine worthiness, and restoring their rightful place in her story as queen mothers, goddesses, and co-creators of a world we want to see. The following slide has become the foundation of my messaging. Peace and love, my beautiful queens. I hope you're having a fabulous day today. It's me, Dionne, coming to you from Peace of Mind. And I wanted to jump on really quick and share a little bit about generational healing, generational thriving. I speak a lot about the trauma, but the trauma is something we are healing from. The generational trauma, those norms, those outdated ways of survival that our ancestors survived for, that we became the hope and the dreams manifested. We don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to stay in these spaces of unworthiness, trying to remember who we are, trying to remember ourselves as spiritual beings. It is time. It is time for us to move into our own narratives, to tell our own stories. When you are walking in your worthiness, there's nothing that can stop you. You move in your excellence. You prioritize yourself. There's no such thing as I'm going to be better tomorrow. You are your best version of you today. And tomorrow you will be your best version of you again, and so on and so on. And you start setting up a legacy of right-mindedness, of thinking with a mindset that's about abundance, about manifestation, about knowing your worth. That's what we want to instill. And it starts with us queens. As we heal our wombs, we heal the community, we heal the village, we heal the heart, and we start to create the world we want to see. But it don't start outside of us. It starts with us. We've got to know our own worth. We've got to know our own excellence. We've got to learn how to thrive and create that legacy for future generations. All right. So as my time in the Women's Spirituality Department comes to a close, I am instantly transported back to the beginning, where prayer, meditation, affirmations, and gratitude became the manifestation of who I am today. I offer gratitude to the professors of the Women's Spirituality Department who provided the space for spiritual expansion through their offerings and who have helped me to develop my academic voice for scholarly work. I want to name Dr. Williams, Dr. Aurora, Dr. Corwin, Dr. Afia Walkingtree, Dr. Kimberly J., Dr. King, Dr. Truxler, Dr. Sundari, Dr. Naharo, Dr. Berazan, Dr. Elam, and Dr. Gibbons. I hold you all in high esteem and with gratitude. In closing, I would like to share that my work remains incomplete and my time here at CIIS continues. I am happy to announce my acceptance into the Ph.D. of Research Psychology with a concentration in integral transpersonal psychology. Here, I plan to continue the work of Sankofa as I complete the daughtering out of my mother line, lay the foundation of new beginnings, and pass on a legacy of generational worth to my grandchildren and their grandchildren, and so on. I also want to focus my research on developing a healing modality for generational trauma that validates prayer, meditation, affirmations, and gratitude as spiritual technologies of transformation. I thank you all for taking the time to come along with me on this ancestral journey of generational trauma to worthiness and witnessing how the Divine Mother has guided me and continues to guide me in this scholarship. Thank you.
So powerful, Dionne. Thank you very much for this. Your work is incredible. And congratulations on your acceptance into the PhD. I am so happy to hear your work is continuing on.
Thank you
We
so much.
do have time for questions. I'm going to put in the chat the website link to Dionne's site, peaceofmindmentalwellness.com. And in the meantime, any questions for Dionne?
Hey, Lisa. You're on mute, Lisa.
Blessings to everyone that is on this evening. Congratulations to you, my sister Dionne. I know you just made an announcement about your acceptance. But what I wanted to know is beyond the George Washington, across the waters to the motherland and back, the sacred burial ground, what is your next spiritual journey that you would like to accomplish?
Oh, breathing. For me, it's just every single day, just taking it one step at a time. I just wake up each and every morning and say, okay, what are we doing today? Where are we going? How are we being guided? I try not to figure it out anymore. I try to, I'm going to take out the word try. I move in a space of trust. That's what Divine Mother told me, to trust her power. And whatever is meant for me that day is what's meant for me that day. I make sure that my emotions are balanced. So all of you know, I don't watch the news. Well, those of you who know me, I don't watch the news. I watch Little House on the Prairie, like nonstop. That's kind of like what I use to kind of keep me very balanced and clear on how I want my day to begin. So right now, for me, it's a lot of women's groups. My website, really just learning to live in that space and offer different healing for different women. I just started a women's group that I'm doing at a local community center. I plan to continue my work in Ghana. I've been doing some work with period poverty, just supporting the young girls with being able to make sure they have menstrual supplies so that they can stay in school throughout the school year. The burial site is something that is ongoing, that continues. We actually just got our 501c3 this weekend. So that was really exciting, and just keep breathing. And thank you for the question. Lucia.
Hi, Dionne. I'm so happy for you. I love you so
Thank
much.
you.
So I just want to start with that. Your presentation was amazing, and um, a couple things. First, my question is really around, as a mother to sons, how do you see this beautiful intergenerational um, journey supporting their
Oh,
lives?
I didn't know if you were finished because I'm laughing because
That's
I'm
it.
like,
Yeah,
if my
that's it.
sons are on here right now, they're like, oh my gosh, because I'm like, when y'all gonna make my grandbabies? I am really looking forward to I have one daughter-in-law, my beautiful Fatima, who's married to my oldest son. They married last year in August. I see legacy moving forward. When I first realized that I was like the mothering out of this lineage, and that I have four sons, and um that my maternal line would not pass to my sons. Um, I originally thought of it as a loss. And I was actually talking to my younger son. He was like, well, I see it as a new beginning. And I was like, wow, that's a beautiful way of seeing it. And it helped me to look at it as completion. And it helped me to then see answer so many whys I had in my life. Like, oh, this is why things come so deep. It's because I'm clearing out the karma. I'm clearing out the old. And I am making sure my sons are aware of who they are, that they know that they are kings from the very beginning, and that they are yoking themselves with right-minded individuals, and that they are producing the seeds that create the world we want to see, that we want to live in, that we want to be. It all comes from our womb. So it starts with us. And yeah, and then making my grandbabies.
I love that so much. Because of time in other hands, I just want to say, so proud of you, and I appreciate being able to be in your presence and
Thank you so
um,
much.
Thank you, Dionne. Absolutely brilliant. Dionne is still here, as well as the rest of our presenters. So please type in the chat any questions you had that you did not get to answer. Any comments, thoughts, they are all here and they will respond. Thank you, Dionne, for your brilliance. I appreciate you. I want to just give a huge hug and appreciation to all of the brilliant scholars here today. I am immensely proud. And this concludes our Capstone Colloquium presentation. So on behalf of the students, the Women's Spirituality Department, and the California Institute of Integral Studies, I thank you for your presence, your support, and your care. These students who you just saw could not have done this without
All right.
the love and support of their friends and family. And we appreciate you being here. Now, we will be having a second Capstone Colloquium on Thursday, once again beginning at 1 p.m. Pacific time. And you'll have the opportunity to witness the work of the rest of our scholars, which is also sheer brilliance. So if you can, please come. I hope you are able to attend and experience the full breadth of brilliance within this community.